a secret Soviet bunker south of Moscow. Just after midnight, the main console flashes one word in red: launch. The computer is reporting that the United States has just fired a nuclear missile at the Soviet Union. The officer in the chair, a 44-year-old lieutenant colonel named Stanislav Petrov, has one job before those missiles land: decide if it's real. Then the screen stops saying one missile. It says two. Then it climbs until it reports 5, inbound from American soil. His orders are simple: report it as real, and that warning races up a command chain built to answer a nuclear attack with everything the Soviet Union has. He has minutes. The alarms are screaming. The whole command post is lit up. And Stanislav Petrov picks up the phone and says it's a false alarm. He doesn't actually know that. He'll later say he was 50-50, a coin flip with the planet on the table. It is September 26, 1983, and this may be the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war by accident. So why was an engineer, not a general, sitting in the most dangerous chair on Earth that night? Because Petrov wasn't a politician or a war planner. He was an engineer in uniform, the kind of man who understood the machines, which is exactly why he was in that seat. His job that night was not to fight a war. It was to read one screen and answer one question: is this real? He'd take the satellite system's verdict, judge it, and pass his judgment up to the people who could give the order. And the system he was reading had only been accepted for full service the year before. It was new, it was unproven. And tonight, for the first time, it was telling him the war had started. The first alert is a single launch from American soil. Petrov is already uneasy. One missile makes no sense as the start of a war. Then the system escalates. It's no longer flagging an anomaly, it's calling it an attack. One launch becomes several. The console reports up to 5 missiles inbound, and the alert climbs to a full missile attack warning. In Petrov's own words, the command post lights up with the word launch, and he knows the thing that frightens him most right now, that if panic takes over, then it's all over. Some of that alarm is already racing up the chain automatically. This was never one man alone with a button. That part of the legend isn't true. But Petrov is the one whose assessment the next layer is waiting on. His report won't pull a trigger. It will be one of the first human judgments in that chain, the call for whether this warning gets treated as real. By later reconstructions, he has less than 5 minutes to decide which word to say. So why did he say false? Part of it was a feeling. I had a funny feeling in my gut, he said later. But the gut was doing math. Petrov reasoned that if the Americans were really starting a nuclear war, they would not start it with 5 missiles. A real first strike would be overwhelming. Hundreds of missiles at once, designed to destroy you before you could answer. 5 was not the opening of a war. 5 was wrong. And there was a second thread. The Soviets had ground radar too, the older, slower system that only catches a missile after it climbs over the horizon. That radar was showing him nothing. But Petrov knew it couldn't see anything yet. That lag was the whole reason the satellites existed, to buy those extra minutes. So the empty radar didn't prove him right, not yet. So he had a brand new system screaming attack, an old system showing silence, a feeling, and a piece of cold logic. And he chose. He told them the satellites were lying. Then he waited to find out if he'd just let his country be destroyed. The minutes passed. Nothing came over the horizon. The radar stayed empty. He was right. But right about what? Investigators would later trace it to something stranger than a broken computer. A cosmic illusion. The Soviet satellites didn't stare straight down at America. They watched sideways, across the curve of the Earth, hunting for the bright flame of a rocket climbing against the black of space. A real launch would stand out like a match struck in a dark room. The angle was even meant to keep stray sunlight off the sensors. But on this night, near the autumn equinox, the sun, the satellite, and the American missile fields slid into a rare alignment the software had never accounted for. High-altitude clouds caught the sunlight and hurled it back, not a soft glare, but a mirror-bright flash straight into the detector. The satellite moved, the clouds shifted, and the flash repeated. One bright point, then another, then another. The clouds didn't look like missiles. The software took those flares of reflected sunlight and did exactly what it was built to do. It labeled them launches and rang the loudest bell it had. It wasn't a broken computer. The sensors weren't malfunctioning. They really did catch a bright flash. The software just couldn't tell sunlight from a launch. On a night its design had never been tested against, that was nearly enough to start a war. Now, the legend says one man's nerve was the only thing between us and nuclear war. The truth is more complicated, and somehow more unsettling. Petrov was not the only safeguard. Above him sat layer after layer of military high command in Moscow. Historians who've studied the Soviet system argue the generals would never have launched on a satellite reading alone. They'd have demanded confirmation, maybe even waited for proof of actual detonations on Soviet ground. As one expert put it bluntly, nobody would have launched anything based on that information. So maybe the world was never 23 minutes from the end. Maybe the system had more breaks than the story admits. But sit inside that bunker for a second. Petrov didn't know any of that for certain. He couldn't see the general's restraint. He could only see 5 missiles and a clock. And the whole machine was built to do one thing: turn a warning into action faster than a human could stop and doubt. Petrov was the doubt. In a system built to move quicker than second-guessing, he was the link that second-guessed. And he was right. That's the real story. Not a finger off a button, but a man who refused to certify a lie as the truth, at the worst possible moment to be wrong. So what does a country give the man who got it right on the night it mattered most? A reprimand. Not for his decision, for his paperwork. In the chaos, Petrov hadn't kept the duty logbook properly. He pointed out that he'd had a phone in one hand and an intercom in the other. There was no third hand for writing. It didn't matter. There was no reward, no promotion, no parade. Acknowledging the night meant acknowledging a catastrophic flaw in the warning system, and that was not a thing the Soviet military wished to write down either. He was reassigned. He left the military the next year. At one point, he had a nervous breakdown, and the whole event simply disappeared, classified and unspoken, for over a decade, until after the Soviet Union itself was gone, when a senior commander, General Yuri Votintsev, helped bring the story to light. International groups and German institutions eventually gave him the recognition his own country never did. A prize in Dresden, an honor at the United Nations, a small, late chorus of strangers saying thank you. He died on the 19th of May 2017 in Fryazino, the town outside Moscow where he'd been living quietly. The world didn't notice for months until a friend called to wish him a happy birthday, and his son answered to say he was already gone. As his son put it, his father had never thought of himself as a hero. He was simply doing his job. On the night the system was wrong, Stanislav Petrov was too busy holding the world together to fill in his logbook. They reprimanded him for the gap in the paperwork, as if the missing line, and not the missiles, had been the real problem. The man who got it right got a reprimand, and then, for years, silence.